Well, a very warm welcome to the 11th in a series of 39 from 39 minutes of webinar from 4 members of the Planning, Environmental and Property team at 39 Essex Chambers. We have a jam-packed webinar for you today, focusing on the white paper published last week, the tautologically named Planning for the Future, which unquestionably has potentially wide-ranging ramifications for the entire planning system. And I'm joined by my esteemed colleagues Thomas Hill QC, Richard Harwood QC, and Philippa Jackson. Not joining us, I'm sorry to say, is Tora Hutton, who had an accident yesterday and broke her wrist, and we wish her a very speedy recovery. Now, on your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. You can send your questions in at any time during the presentation. Please make them of a general nature rather than seeking any specific advice, and we'll try and pick them up as many as we can as time allows. If you're struggling with the technology, then also please use the Q&A button, and one of our excellent webinar producers located in the mothership will try and assist. The webinar is being recorded, and so if you miss any part of it or want to re-watch it, you can up from tomorrow when the recording will be available to see again. The webinar focuses on the white paper, a white paper which has been trailed by the Prime Minister no less as, I quote, a radical reform unlike anything we have seen since the Second World War. He says fixing a system which, and he then works metaphors to death, is no longer fit for human habitation and which is, I quote, not more fiddling around the edges, not simply painting over the damp patches, but levelling the foundations and building from the ground up a whole new planning system for England. So it can't get more ambitious than that. I have to start by asking my colleagues the very first question posed by the white paper itself. What 3 words do you associate with the planning system? And I'm just going to throw in my 3 words: delay, political, and over-elaborate. Philippa.
Yes, mine don't sound that different. I'm going to say slow, inconsistent, and not very elegant, but user unfriendly.
Good, well, that is definitely 3 words. Tom?
Well, Peter, I've been playing a lot of Scrabble over lockdown, so I'm going for high-scoring words, and mine are accretive, cumbersome, and dysfunctional, with a Y.
Oh, I like those. Those are good. Richard?
Not sure what I get from mine. Vital, political, and engaging.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I'm going to ask Tom to start off by giving us an overview of the white paper. Tom?
Thank you, Peter. Well, the publication of this white paper is further evidence that the MHCLG is a hive of activity at present. And I'm sure that this activity is all well-intentioned, but we shall have to see whether it's well-directed. The proposals that I'm sure most of you have seen, trailed, and may indeed have read by now, look to the future and are seeking stakeholder engagement for a wide-ranging review of the planning system as we know it. And no one can doubt the scale of the exercise, which in my view at least is laudable. By way of context, these emerging white paper proposals, some of which are to a greater or lesser degree inchoate, are for the future, expressly for the future, and sit alongside parallel consultations on reforms within the current system that are also underway at the present time. And you will have seen, I'm sure, proposals now out for consultation on reform of the standard method for assessing housing numbers in local plans, for delivering what are called first homes, for supporting small and medium-sized construction companies by adjusting for a temporary period what constitutes a small site for the purposes of affordable housing contributions, and also for the extension of the permission in principle procedure, which was introduced first for brownfield land and then for small sites, so that it now applies or would apply if the consultation is favourably received for major applications as well. And these proposals in relation to PIP have the potential to mesh with the Pillar 1 proposals on the reform of local plans, as Richard Harwood will explain in due course. And other consultations are expected on other aspects of the current system later on this year. At the same time, of course, we've already seen major revisions to the scope of PD rights and a radical overhaul of the Used Classes Order, which in my view is likely to have a wide variety of unintended consequences. So the pieces on the board are already on the move. And of course, at the same time, we have one of the greatest peacetime shocks to our economy and to the way we live our lives, the fallout of which cannot yet be ascertained, but which most commentators believe will be profound, as we've all been forced over a long period to do things in a different way, and in particular to spend far more time in our homes. The members of the government who are underwriting the white paper appear to appreciate this context, and it's expressly referred to in the preamble, but it's plainly too early for anyone to call the scale of these impacts. Now, I've read the white paper carefully, and from my perspective at least, its critique of the present system appears to focus upon three matters. I have encapsulated them in this way, that the current system incorporates too much discretion, gives rise to too much delay, and is generally too Delphic, that is, too uncertain and unclear in the answers and outcomes it provides. The latter two criticisms are not new ones. The slow speed, complexity, and uncertainty of the planning system have frequently been the source of complaint over my time in practice. Various administrations of varying political hues have tried to cut the Gordian knot with greater or lesser degrees of success, and all too often the result has been more delay and greater complexity. However, the criticism of the scope of the discretion afforded to local planning authorities, and in particular the democratically elected politicians who comprise local planning authorities, has not normally been so public a focus of complaint, and it's bound, in my view at least, to be the most contentious element of the white paper. So from my perspective, at least, three core themes emerge from the white paper when viewed as a whole. Standardization to combat the excessive and sometimes arbitrary exercise of discretion by local planning authorities in performing their plan-making and decision-taking functions. Streamlining to combat excessive delay. And simplicity, which plainly overlaps with streamlining to a large degree to combat the complexity of the present system. There's a clear move back, in my view, to top-down planning, with many key decisions being taken out of the hands of local planning authorities, or at least set more or less in stone by the time of the adoption of a new world local plan. Now, I think stakeholders will be pleased to see some elements of the proposed standardization and resist others, in particular where blanket development-friendly designations are to be applied to extensive tracts or valued but not designated countryside. In my view, the complaint about complexity rings a little hollow. The unfortunate truth is that good planning is a multifaceted process requiring many detailed inputs from many sources to come together at the same time. This is not and never will be a straightforward exercise, and it requires a core of skilled practitioners working within a well-defined and enforced timeframe if it's to work effectively. The white paper also makes welcome recognition of the importance of good planners, incentivized to remain in post to see through key processes. There are proposals across a wide range of subject matters with a welcome move towards the digital age and a range of new carrot and stick proposals to encourage sustainable development, such as fast tracking the beautiful, which sounds admirable, subject of course to the eternal conundrum, what is beauty? With that thought uppermost in your mind, I return to you, Peter.
Tom, thank you very much. That is very helpful. Can I just pick up a question that we've had in whilst you've been speaking? and the question is that if we're reviewing the planning system root and branch, should this also include a root and branch approach to greenbelt and take the opportunity now to address this constraint? The white paper was silent on this point, suggesting it's a step too far politically. Do you have an answer to that question? Which I'm
well, of course, it could be the subject of a whole webinar, Peter, as I'm sure you're aware.
It may well be next time.
Indeed, it may well be. We all know that it is something of the sacred cow, and personally, I don't expect the government to tackle it because it's politically too sensitive. But it will, of course, come up as part of the consideration of which are protected areas, and I'm sure that there will be a review in any local plan that is being adopted, subject to the new regime of Greenbelt. But yeah, as to the whole issue of whether Greenbelt is a good thing or a bad thing, I rather doubt that the government has the appetite to tackle that.
Yes, I mean, that's just too bold for even this government. So just one other question I've got actually, Tom. Has the government identified the right problems in your view?
I think it broadly speaking has, but I'm just anxious that it isn't proceeding on the basis that there is a simple answer to the complexity issue. As I've said in my introduction, having spent over 30 years at the coalface, as have you all, it is an extremely complex process that we undertake, and plan making cannot be shoehorned into a month or two if it is to be done properly in a way that endures and has the respect of all the people who have to apply it and work.
Absolutely good point. Absolutely right. Okay, well, look, let's just press on and turn to the detail, such as it is. The consultation's divided into 3 pillars, as they are called. Planning for development is pillar 1. Planning for beautiful and sustainable places is pillar 2. And planning for infrastructure and connected places is pillar 3. And we're going to deal with each of those pillars during the course of this presentation this morning. Within those broad headings, there are proposals within the white paper and questions. And being benevolent, one has to assume that the white paper is there to lead a discussion, although time will tell as to whether the results are a foregone conclusion. And Richard Harwood is going to assist in identifying how we can best frame our consultation responses to deal with the questions that are raised, and obviously some questions which aren't raised. Richard, could you turn to pillar 1, please, with regard to planning for development, and tell us what is in store for local plans?
Peter, thank you. And it's not actually as radical as it might sound once you sort of read through the white paper and assimilated. In some respects, it goes back to 2016 and the aspirations of the Housing and Planning Act of that year, and also the Local Plans Expert Group report. Broadly, there'll be 3 areas geographically within local plans: growth areas, renewal areas, and protected areas. But they're quite distinct roles within those. Growth areas, the plans will meant to specify what uses should go into growth areas. They're going to be strategic sites type opportunities. Talked about the plan granting outline planning permission. Slightly odd in that sense, because there is a mechanism in the Housing and Planning Act, not yet been brought into force, for local plans to grant permission in principle. That's the more obvious route than outline planning permission. Outline planning permission, you've got to draft all the conditions that attach. Permission in principle, you set the parameters, and conditions effectively are dealt with later on technical detail consent. So that is probably not actually going to be that contentious, because once a big site's been allocated, in broad speak, the principal decision ought to have been taken there. How master planning will be dealt with is not totally clear. It may be in the local plan, it may be pushed off to the later stages. Renewal areas, those will be one where there'll be a presumption in favour of some development, however it's described. That, broadly speaking, renewal areas, I suspect, are going to be existing built-up areas which don't have any particularly special characteristics. But there will be a need to say what can go on there. It's meant to be harder to justify non-compliant planning applications, but there's consideration about automatic permitted development rights for certain pattern book schemes, which we'll come to later on. The final category are protected areas where development is broadly going to be resisted. A lot of those are non-planning designations, like national parks, AONBs, conservation areas, it's not in the planning policy process, but they will also include greenbelt, countryside outside growth areas, and potentially residential gardens if the authority wants. So there's no change to the substance of planning policy. It's a purely processed document in those terms. If anything, in those situations, national planning policy for development management is expected to apply. Housing numbers is probably going to be the most contentious part of the local plan element, which is that what is proposed is that there should be a binding national standard methodology to give a figure for particular authorities. And the primary proposal is that central government will not only do what's really effectively done at the moment of having a mechanism for calculating what the OAN is, but will then do the next step, which is moving from the statistical requirement for numbers to what the requirement is reflecting local circumstances. So central government will have to take into account all the environmental constraints within the local authority area and what its potential are. Now, there's nothing in the white paper about how that will be done, but effectively, looking at the first 2 weeks of the development plan examination hearings being sorted out somehow by central government. So there's a lot more that's going to need to be looked at on that, and I think that will be contentious. As you may have picked up, quite a housing focus, no mention of minerals or waste. A lot of emphasis on local design codes in local plans and also in neighbourhood plan processes, whereas development management policies should be left to the Nppf, unless there's a very good reason to do something different locally. A variety of changes on process, sustainable development tests rather than soundness. Not too sure quite how that will work out. Real concern about, as expressed by LPEG, about whether sustainability appraisals actually work. General conclusion that they don't. Sort of plus good approach isn't totally informative. Duty to cooperate is to be scrapped, but the white paper doesn't have any solutions to the problem of strategic planning beyond the original local authority area. And that is something which everyone's been grappling with since the Localism Act, and really does need sorting. There's meant to be a slimmed down delivery test, regard to infrastructure requirements, to see what all that involves. Statutory duty to make local plans, and statutory time limits to 2.5 years. Interestingly, that was proposed by us in LPEG 4 years ago. We thought that, I was on the group, we thought that 2.5 years was realistic for the current local plan system, and we'll see how that's sort of pushed through.
Some would say generous.
Well, I think it gives time for consultation, it gives time for working it out, but the problem with the local plan system has been that it's tended to drag on, and I think unless you do set firm deadlines, then it will continue to do that, whatever you do with the process on that. Examination processes, shorter reasoning, binding changes which we have at the moment, the all right to an oral hearing would seem to be being dropped. And there's generally a move for far more high-tech approach. Public involvement promoted, although the white paper still needs to do a lot of thinking about how that's actually going to be achieved.
So growth, renewal, protect, these three designations, is it zoning by another name, or is it zoning, not zoning?
I think it's not zoning, because the nature of a zoning system, take an example of Hong Kong, is that you have particular designations and then quite specific authorizations, and what's in there automatically has consent, subject to then working out a sort of building design consent following on from that. This is far more broad, and each of those three categories will have, firstly, sub-levels of detail underneath it, and different approaches within it. So it's actually, I think, going to be not much different from what we have at the moment.
Tom, what does it mean for development management in the context of the proposals for local plans?
Yes, Peter. So development management implications. Standing back from the detail, it's clear to me that one of the aims of the white paper, as I've already foreshadowed, is radically to reduce the role of the development management process as a point at which the merits and demerits of a proposal will be debated, by scaling back the scope of the discretion currently residing with local planning authorities and, of course, their elected members at the development management stage. Thus, development management is not accorded its own pillar in the new white paper, but is left to absorb the consequences of the other three. And the most significant of these, it seems to me, will be the lines in the sand drawn by the new local plans, defining areas as growth, renewal, and protected areas, where the different approaches discussed in the white paper and just referred to by Richard will apply. And it seems to me that the critical ground for the battles that will be fought will be the watershed between renewal and protected areas. So that's out with the development management process. However, I do note that the door is left open for what one might call a conventional planning application, which does not accord with the plan in growth and renewal areas. And the words used are, if local circumstances change suddenly or an unanticipated opportunity arises. I can see those being deployed to good effect in the future. But processes will need to remain in place to cope with that eventuality. I also note that the DCO route is floated as a potential means of advancing an exceptionally large proposal, such as a new town. So there's certainly no appetite to move away from the DCO process established under the Planning Act 2008, and indeed it may well be more intensively used for development types which have traditionally come forward within the development plan. Generally, however, one would expect the consequence of these proposals to be that development management is focused upon filling in the detail with the principle and the presumptions firmly established at the plan-making stage. Of course, as others have suggested, this is really not very far adrift from previous expectations for the development plan system. The problem has been, in the past, the woeful failure of so many local planning authorities to adopt an up-to-date plan, and the need for multiple ad hoc developer-led proposals to plug the gaps in the supply of land for development to meet housing and other needs. In any event, as I understand it at least, the development management process can be expected to mirror the present reserved matters process in instances where the principles have been established at the plan-making stage, in particular in growth areas. And I suspect that many issues that are left at that stage will go to officers as opposed to planning committees, as is of course presently the case with many reserved matters applications. And consistent planning conditions with national standard conditions to cover common issues are also likely to make the discharge of conditions more straightforward. Now, as Philippa will discuss under Pillar 2, there's also encouragement for schemes to look more exciting and diverse. Proposal 10 is for the framework to be revised to include that master plans and design codes for substantial development sites should seek to include a variety of development types by different participants to allow phases to come forward together. And this would appear to be a response to the 2018 Letwin review, which now seems a distant memory. At the other end of the telescope, there's real focus on making the user experience much easier for those engaging with the planning process and on seeking a broader level of engagement with communities. This is seen through the emphasis on digital technology to make such engagement much easier. But it will be interesting to see the extent to which full commitment to digital planning can be achieved, and the extent to which, if at all, the planning process can become wholly digitized. And whilst for many younger participants in the process, such as we four, we will have agile digital skills, there remains a significant proportion, particularly the elderly, for whom the internet remains a very uncertain beast, and those in remote areas with poor access to broadband who may not be in a position to embrace digital planning. So parallel systems, with all that that attends, may need to be perpetuated for the time being. There's also emphasis on making applications much easier to read. There's a proposal that major development, beyond relevant drawings and plans, should only have one standardized planning document of no more than 50 pages. Look forward to seeing that. I think that's a succinct summary of how development management is likely to be affected as I read the white paper, Peter.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. How different do you envisage the development management process will look if all these reforms come into place? And we've actually had a question whilst you were talking, asking what role there will be for planning committees in decision taking in due course. The white paper seems, again, it seems to lack a lot of detail about that.
Yes, it certainly doesn't rule out the committee's power to, as it were, call in a matter for its determination. And I'm sure that that isn't what's intended. But one suspects that on the whole, planning authorities will be set up so that, as with so many reserved matters applications, the committee won't see them unless something is expressly drawn to their attention, and they go through a particular protocol to call in that issue for consideration by the committee. I'm sure this is something that will be worked up in further detail in due course. I suspect that overall the process will be familiar, but there will be these shifts in emphasis and that there will be more decision making by planning officers and less by planning committees overall. So that really emphasises the importance for those who want to get involved in the process to engage at the local plan stage. And indeed, if they don't do that, it may be too late to halt or influence a particular proposal by the time it comes before the development management officers and committees.
Philippa, I see that you've been looking at the post box or the post bag and questions that have been asked of us. Do you have any particular question you'd like to answer?
Yes, can I pick up this one for you, Tom, which I think is interesting, and it's in the post bag. What does the panel, or rather you're on the video, but what do you think about the implications for neighbourhood plans, and should communities well into production of such a plan continue with their work?
Well, my view, both having read the white paper and for other reasons I won't delve into, is that the government is committed to neighbourhood plans, and the neighbourhood plan system has a lot of support in the government and on the back benches of the governing party. And my view is that they will have to find a way to embrace the neighbourhood plan.
We're getting some feedback there. I don't know if it's just me, but it certainly there's quite a lot of. It's difficult to hear you.
Okay. Well, I'll come back and deal with that later.
Yeah, Philippa, I'd like to move on now to Pillar 2, planning for beautiful and sustainable places.
Yeah.
What's proposed as part of the second pillar?
Yes, thank you, Peter. So Pillar 2 covers proposals 11 to 18 of the paper, and I think it's interesting to note that beauty is included in the title alongside sustainability. And of course, sustainability is a concept that we're all now familiar with, and I think this suggests that the government ultimately wants the concept of beauty to have the same status in planning terms as the concept of sustainability. And I think that's a very admirable ambition, but as Tom noted earlier, it does beg the question of what is beauty. Anyway, moving on, proposals 11 to 14 focus on improving design. Proposals 15 to 18 focus on the environment and climate change. So we've got a proposal for design guidance and codes, which are to be prepared locally with community involvement. And those codes are to be made binding on decisions about development. And this is a really critical part of the overall paper and the proposals relating to design. So we've got at the national level, there's the National Design Guide, the National Model Design Code, and a revised manual for streets, which will provide the framework. But the paper does recognise the importance of local engagement at this stage, and indeed that there will be differences in local vernacular and character. So the proposal is that local design codes and guides will be produced, but these will only be given weight in the decision-making process if authorities can prove there's been local engagement. And where those local codes aren't in place, national codes will govern decision-making. At the same time, there's a proposal for a new national expert body, which is going to, I quote, help authorities make effective use of design guidance and codes. Presumably what's envisaged by that is a design body which operates along the lines of natural England or historic England. And at the same time, each authority is expected to have its own chief officer for design and placemaking. And of course, that's going to require greater resources. So we see a suggestion in the white paper that there is going to be additional funding for planning departments, which I'm sure will be extremely welcome. And then we've got the proposal, which is perhaps the most significant, and it follows the recommendations from the Building Better Commission, which has been dubbed the fast track for beauty. And that basically falls into three parts. First of all, there are going to be changes, if the proposals are carried through, to the Nppf, so that schemes which comply with local design codes and guides have a positive advantage and will get permission more quickly. So that sounds awfully like a presumption in favour of beauty to me. And then secondly, there's going to be a proposal for a master plan as a condition attached to the outline planning permission, which is granted for significant development in growth areas. The detail in that plan, of course, to be dependent on the stage at which any existing or non-existing scheme is at. And then thirdly, there's a proposal for change to permitted development rights to deliver pattern book style development, as was mentioned earlier. I think that's an interesting proposal because often permitted development is criticised quality development, way in which it helps. There is a recognition that would still be needed.
I think we seem to have lost Philippa there. At least we certainly, the sound. Philippa, are you there?
GPDO, the prior approval process is becoming ever more significant as rights are extended. And turning to the environment, as mentioned earlier,
Philippa, we're having difficulty hearing you, and we've lost.
I'm so sorry.
We're having difficulty hearing you, and we've lost your video.
Can you hear me now?
Not very well, I'm afraid. Could we? I think we might just move on to.
I'm so sorry. I can hear you.
No, we're not hearing you, Philippa. Sorry, Philippa, we're not hearing you. We're going to move on. We've got there's a question that's come through actually on the whilst you were talking, Philippa, about the revised policy framework, and the question is, how do we secure beautiful, i.e. well-designed developments, and how will that fit in with Nppf policy? We see you again now, Philippa. Do you want to answer that?
Yes. So sorry. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, yeah, and we can see you as well.
Exactly. Yes, indeed. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened there. I could hear you perfectly, but it's a bit of a mystery. Yes. In terms of, and in fact, fortunately, I'd largely covered, I think, that section. But in terms of how the proposals will fit with existing Nppf policies, as I mentioned, I don't know if you heard me, but it looks as if there's going to be some kind of positive presumption in favour of developments which comply with design codes. And then a concept which features heavily in the paper, but the relevant proposal is actually under Pillar 1, not 2, is the requirement to deliver beauty net gains. And of course, the concept of net gain is one we're all familiar with in relation to biodiversity. So it's really a lateral application of that policy test, which seems to fit with the objectives of the paper in this regard. But ultimately, delivering safe and well-designed development, of course, already comes under the heading of sustainability. And we already have paragraph 127A of the Nppf, I think it is, which the area, which is arguably a net gain requirement. And so I think what we'll see is further bolstering of these policies, an enhanced focus on design. But the real challenge is going to be to come up with the principles and the guides, which are sufficiently clear and binding about what constitutes good design in the first place. And that seems to me to be where the real challenge lies.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you very much. We've had 47 questions coming in this morning. And Richard, would you like to pick one from the post bag to respond to?
Okay, picking not
if anything,
quite right.
Well, it jumps out to me.
Yeah, Philippa.
I don't know. I was just looking as well when I was struggling with my technology. But I think this is a really interesting one, and it's this: how can these proposals about beauty and good design be squared with the extension of permitted development rights in the recently published GPDO amendment orders? And the author suggests that surely the relaxation of the requirement to obtain planning permission simply isn't conducive to requiring good design. I think that's a very interesting question. Over to you.
Yeah. Well, I think prior approval is sort of shifting. So you look at the latest PD rights. Not only is design, in fact, which is on agricultural farms as well, but heritage is coming into that. Prior approval is moving from, I think, an often formality to something which is a subdivision of a planning application. So you can pick it up in those terms, but to get anyone to follow that, I think that's going to be somewhat more cumbersome. Where there needs to be the care is how you deal with impacts on setting of heritage assets, the possibility that renewal areas are adjacent to quite sensitive protected locations, and that does limit the extent to which you can simply assume that permitted development is going to be workable in those occasions. Planning is all about context. It's all about what's around you, and that has to be dealt with.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn on, because time is marching on, to Pillar 3, planning for infrastructure and connected places. And there are significant plans in the white paper for infrastructure and affordable housing. Now, this pillar covers what are called proposals 19 to 22. SIL is out. Section 106 planning obligations are out. The first reform aims to tackle SIL. Most practitioners agree that, and I think one would get in a room a round of applause by saying that not only is the drafting of the SIL regulations terrible, not only are they horribly complicated, but they often have the effect of preventing and delaying development. And the paper says that it should be reformed, but I apprehend, reading between the lines, that reform is so significant that we can safely say that it's a replacement. The proposal is for an infrastructure levy. This would be set at a national flat rate, either area specific or a single rate. It would be charged on the final value of a development or an assessment of sales value if the development is not sold. It'll be levied at the point of occupation, and it will include a value-based minimum threshold under which there would be no levy. Revenue would continue to be spent locally, and local authorities would have greater flexibility about how it's spent. The proposal is also that local authorities would have the ability to borrow against it, so that the infrastructure levy can forward fund development. Proposal 20 is that the infrastructure levy would be extended to include development permitted through the GDPO. And that makes a lot of sense, because the use of PD rights like office to resi and the new rights which have recently been introduced can prove extremely profitable, and there's no logical reason why they should escape an infrastructure levy. And it seems fair that it should be payable across the board, however planning permission is received. And then there is this very small detail that section 106 be abolished. Now, I think that seems extremely unlikely. I mean, apart from anything else, section 106 doesn't just deal with planning obligations and the obligation to pay money, but it deals with a whole raft of other obligations and conditions. And I think it's very far-fetched to assume that the red pen will be taken to section 106. So, on the whole, some sensible and wise proposals, in my humble view, in relation to infrastructure levy. Should we have a look at the postbag and see whether there are any points on that? And yes, there's a question here which is, there are fears that the end of section 106 means an end to affordable housing. Is that likely to be the case? Well, no. Of course, there have been some big headlines on that, but I think we can safely say that whatever is put in its place, the white paper will not be heralding the end of affordable housing. And indeed, proposal 21 is that the infrastructure levy would deliver the affordable housing. And so the proposal is that developers would be able to secure in-kind delivery on site. So the difference between the price at which the affordable home was sold to the provider and the market price would be offset against the final infrastructure levy bill. And the aim would be to incentivize on-site delivery of affordable housing where appropriate. The paper recognises that there is some risk here, and it says that in the event of a market fall, local authorities could be allowed to flip a proportion of affordable homes to back to market homes, which the developer can then sell, and if levy liabilities are insufficient, he will not be penalised. And no doubt that flexibility would also allow effectively to pushing the affordable housing back in time in large infrastructure, large housing developments. The next paragraph posits the possibility that there may be scope for local authorities requiring the developer to revert back to cash contributions if affordable homes aren't of a sufficient quality to be taken up by an affordable housing provider. There's also a proposal, quite an interesting one, of a right of first refusal of local authorities and affordable housing providers to buy up a set proportion of a housing site at a discounted price. And the proportion would be set nationally, and the developer would have discretion over which homes were sold in that way. So cash payments could be made in lieu, or affordable units could be sold back to the developer to raise additional money to provide affordable homes elsewhere. Those are, in very brief terms, the proposals in relation to the infrastructure levy. Again, I think they're mainly sensible and to be applauded. postbag time. Anyone got any questions which they'd like to pick up from the postbag?
On the levy one, there's another quite interesting
Yes.
one here. Moving on. Yeah, no, well, I thought this was quite interesting one. I'll pick it up and I'll see if I can answer it. If the proposal, it says, is for a flat, nationally set levy, are there implications for a disparity between money available to areas in which homes attract a higher value, e.g. the southeast, versus areas where house prices are lower? I think that's quite interesting. It's certainly one of the concerns which has come out in the press, and I think it's likely that the issue is going to be whether the money received by the infrastructure levy will be spent solely in the area where it's raised, or whether there's going to be some kind of equalisation or levying up from central government.
Yeah.
But the setting of area-specific amounts for the levy may well assist.
Good. Okay. Now look, we'll press on because there's still more to do, and we're coming up to our 39 minutes. Consultation, Richard. Can you just tell us and how we can best respond to this ragbag of proposals? Actually, that sounds rather rude.
Well, put it. Yeah, so the consultation runs to the 29th of October, and I think in responding, have a mind on not simply the primary proposals, but the secondary alternatives, and to think in terms of those various proposals or how you would want to change the broad thrust of what it's doing, what the detail is going to be underneath. How would you carry out those elements? And I think also look at other things that need to be done. This is intended to be a simplification of the system and involve primary legislation to do it. What would really benefit the process, it seems to me, is experience and evidence-based responses. Bear in mind that the white paper doesn't take any issues out of the planning system, anything it adds on design. The question is how those issues are dealt with, and when they are dealt with, and what information there is for doing this. So a few big questions for all the issues. How different will it actually be, and what is it going to achieve? To what extent are the changes going to be used in practice? There is a terrible history of planning reform of making changes which then just lie on the statute book unused. Simplified planning zones, LDOs, lots of things like that. So we need to have something that doesn't avoid that. So a few particular examples. What information are you going to need within the plan making process? How detailed a consent? Is there a possibility that the outline planning permission on the local plan process actually gets too rigid and then the scheme proceeds under a planning application? Infrastructure levy, I think we do need to think about whether one size will fit all between something like an urban extension or a new settlement, where the infrastructure requirements on-site and off-site are absolutely huge. The existing land value is relatively modest, to an urban site, which at the moment is probably not going to be contributing a great deal in infrastructure in CLM 1 and 6, but where the existing land use values may be actually be quite substantial for the developer to cope with. How is all that going to work? And one thing which I think has run through some of our questions and some of our discussion is that it seems to me that local democracy and public participation within the white paper is quite underwritten. It's not really been sort of worked through within the paper, and particular input from local government and from all sectors engaged in the process, I think is going to be important in terms of sorting out these elements. So Peter, those are some thoughts on consultation.
I think we're going to bring the webinar to a conclusion, and I just like to offer the following points by way of summary. And for some reason, the words of Lord Melbourne, who was Prime Minister twice, I think, from 1834 to 1841, come to mind. Reform, aren't things bad enough already? And because of the Prime Minister's apparent addiction to metaphors, one has to ask whether what the white paper proposes is tantamount to throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of good things in this white paper. A simplified planning system which has, for example, a plan upon which there are marked designations of growth for substantial development, defined by policy, renewal areas and areas which require protection. And those are all helpful, simple things, and there won't be any repetition of policies in the plans which are already set out in the framework. Simplification and digitization of the planning application process, with an emphasis on data rather than volumes of EIA material, which is a massive industry, of course, and doesn't get read. All of this is good. The plan has to be produced in 30 months. I would say that's still a generous timescale. Abolish the duty to cooperate. Good, no one likes that. Many plans have been tripped up on that, and it has been used as an excuse by too many local authorities for delaying the adoption of plans. But herein lies a general pitfall for the proposals. As Richard alluded to, using the standardized methodology appears to be regional plans on steroids. It is the antithesis of localism. And again, this is, of course, all a personal view. I don't see abolishing the duty to cooperate or effectively bringing in a national standardized approach a bad thing, because it gives certainty and it must be understood for what it is. But the pitfall, and this is not explained, is how local authorities mediate the housing requirement under the standardized methodology with the requirements to protect land which is deserving of protection. Under the duty to cooperate, there was an ability to set off housing requirements in one local authority by gifting the requirement to another. But I see no clear mechanism for that in the white paper. On what basis will any shortfall in housing be picked up by reason of protect designations being adhered to? Nor is there any explanation of how cross-boundary issues will be dealt with. So this is all very disappointing. Frankly, I see significant pushback on these proposals from Tory-controlled local authorities, which have significant greenbelt designations, and their neighbours. Another area, the calculation of a 5-year housing land supply, will be jettisoned on, I have to say, a delightfully naive assumption that it won't be needed at all because all local authorities under the new regime will be able to provide for 5-year housing land supply. I would humbly suggest that that's a very unwise assumption. So I gently ask, in perhaps the manner of conducting a strategic environmental assessment, oops, that's gone as well, does the white paper contain the most appropriate alternative proposal? And I add 2 further thoughts. The first is the danger of large-scale reform of this type proposed in this case might have the opposite effect of slowing down the planning system, as some local authorities see it as an opportunity to delay preparation of development plans until the new system comes into operation. And of course, we saw that when we had the once-in-a-generation change in 2011 with the Localism Act, and regional strategies were abolished. Further, there's a danger that developers might find that it's better to delay their application or even commence their development until what they may view as a more propitious development environment emerges under the new system. And second, and this is obviously a personal view, I'm far from convinced that the demolition of this surely listed structure, the English planning system, can be justified by either the harm which it said exists and by what is proposed to be its replacement. The devil, as always in planning, will be in the detail, and we don't have that yet. That's all from us. We hope you have found this useful. We urge you to respond to the consultation. We apologise for not answering your almost 60 questions in detail, but goodbye from all of us at 39 Essex Chambers, and keep safe.
Goodbye.
Bye.